watching Rogers TV. This program is brought to you by Rogers Xfinity, connecting you to more of what you love. Visit Rogers.com for more details.
And welcome everyone to the first RTV Sports Rap of March. We are cruising our way towards the summer months and cruising our way towards the NHL trade deadline coming up on this Friday, March 7th. Joining me today for kind of an NHL trade deadline preview and some NFL stuff is myself, Spencer Byers, Lucas Ireland, Mark McKelvey, and of course, J.C. Coots. Welcome in, gentlemen. And I think we have to start off with a trade we haven't had a chance to talk about yet because it released literally while we were at the rink, I believe, either during the Niagara game or it was during the Kitchener game. It was Seth Jones being traded from the Chicago Blackhawks to the Florida Panthers for Spencer Knight and a 2027 first-round pick. Now, I got to be honest, my first reactions was, wait, Seth Jones got traded and his $9 million? Well, in fairness, they did retain 25% at Chicago, so it's now more like a $7 million Seth Jones, which I still think is a little too rich for my blood. But what's your guys' opinion on the trade? Spencer Knight in a first-round pick one way, Seth Jones the other. JC, I'll start with you. Who do you think kind of immediate reaction won that trade?
Well, I think if you're a Florida Panthers fan, you think you've won that trade. Obviously, they are trying to bulk up a little bit. They want to repeat as Stanley Cup champions. We know that based on the tight race right now towards the top of the Eastern Conference, and especially with the Leafs up there battling, Florida's got to do something to get better. Let's not forget that it was just announced today that Matthew Tkachuk is now going to miss the rest of the season with a groin injury. I'm sure he'll be back for the playoffs. He definitely strikes me as a guy that's going to tough it out, but Florida's going to make those kind of moves to load up. And this is a guy that, I mean, he's been up and down in his NHL career, obviously, but I think if you put him on the right team, in the right atmosphere, certainly Florida is that. He's probably going to excel. Chicago is... it's not a great place to be if you're a player. Ask Connor Bedard right now. So, of course, he hasn't looked his best. He hasn't looked his strongest. But now you put him on a winning team, a first-place team, or at least one that's gunning for first, and one that has recently won a championship. This could pay big dividends for the Panthers because it's not going to be easy to come out of the East this year.
Not just that, JC. He's also not expected to be the number one guy like he was in Chicago, even like he was at times in his previous locations. Like he's not expected to be the 1A guy. He's now expected to be one of the guys, and I think that will be very advantageous for a guy like Seth Jones that at $9 million on a really, really bad team, he kind of was the focal point of a lot of hate, you would say, for the Chicago Blackhawks and how they've been run over the last couple of years. Now I'll go to you, Mark McKelvey. What was your immediate thought of the trade being announced?
I think my first thought was makes sense for both sides. You get your goaltender if you're Chicago, and if you're Florida, I don't think they truly replaced the loss of Brandon Montour from last season, who was such an important part of that Stanley Cup winning team. I don't think it can be understated what he brought to the table. You know, he had a little bit of offense, but he's a heart and soul type player. I'm not sure they're a complete comparison right there. Like they're not identical players in Seth Jones and Brandon Montour, both right shot D though, and both have got some experience in the league. In the case of Seth Jones, he was just frustrated. He called a shot. He wanted out of Chicago because he hadn't been in the playoffs in the last 5 years. He turned 30 years old last season. So obviously he's starting to look at where his career is heading and now talk about getting a huge opportunity. I think if you're the Panthers, the one leg up you have right now is any player you bring in automatically kind of gets revitalized because of the group that they're going around and the culture there. But for Chicago, good that they got their goaltender now, guys. But I mean, you guys both said it. It's not a great spot right now. I'm not sure it's going to turn around next season, maybe even the year after. The Connor Bedard contract will be coming up after next year, and they got to figure out what they do with him. And, you know, is he demanding that generational talent money? There's a lot going on there. Kyle Davidson, the GM of the Blackhawks, is in a tough spot. But as we all know, you need goaltending. So at least he's addressed that with a guy that I think is going to take advantage of this opportunity.
Former first-round pick was Spencer Knight back when goalies were kind of going in the first round for a 3-year span. Spencer Knight went in the first round. Then I believe the year after was Wallstead and Casa. And then the year after, I believe, was Askarov. And that basically since then, It's been no goalies in the first round, and it probably won't be for a while unless we get another guy that is hyped like Askarov and like Spencer Knight. And I believe Askarov also was dealt in the preseason from Nashville to San Jose. So some of those first round goalies are still being dealt because they're not exactly developing as teams would have hoped as a first round goalie, because we know obviously the development curve with goalies is a little bit longer than every other position in hockey. And I'll go to you, Lucas, because again, Spencer Knight's 23, year older than me, a couple years older than you, still has a lot of room to grow, still has a lot of potential, and he's played pretty well for Florida in some limited time behind Sergei Bobrovsky, who's had a revitalization with the Florida Panthers. And that first round pick's not until 2027, so that kicks the can down the road for a couple of years where maybe Florida starts kind of having to get into a retooling phase by the time you get to 2027, I guess would be the hope for Chicago. But Lucas, what was the thought for you when you saw the trade?
Well, I agree. And when it comes to Knight, I like Spencer Knight. I think he is a very good young goaltender. He's played some very great hockey. I've enjoyed every game that I've seen him play. He looks to be like a future starter, and maybe he can be that for Chicago. But I do agree with what the other guys have said, and I don't see Chicago turning things around next year or even the year after that. It's going to take some time. It's been a rough, it seems like it's been a rough place to play for quite a while. They've missed the playoffs quite a bit, and it's unfortunate for them, but I mean, what can you do? And when it comes to Seth Jones, I knew he was leaving right after that interview about a week or two ago, whenever it was. I think before he had requested a trade, you could just kind of tell like he wasn't happy there anymore. He wanted out. When going to a team like the Florida Panthers, I like that move for him. I think that he is a very solid player, and I think that he will, play well for the Panthers. And with the Panthers, he'll have a much higher chance of being a Stanley Cup champion, especially if they can go back to back this year. So I think for both teams, there's a win in this trade. I'm just looking forward to seeing how or who ends up with the bigger W in the end.
Well, Lucas, I'm going to stick with you for this one because this is kind of a two-parter. Gustav Nyquist of the Nashville Predators was dealt for a second-round pick in 2026 to Minnesota from Nashville. Nashville was coined the winners of the offseason, the previous winter, or summer technically, because they signed Brady Shea. They brought Gustav Nyquist in. They have Jonathan Marchessault. They have Steven Stamkos. They have Ryan O'Reilly. The list goes on. And they've been horrible. They've been one of the worst teams in the NHL consistently throughout this year, even with UC Saros, who's one of the best goalies in the NHL, has previously been. This year's not been up to his standard. There's a reason why he really wasn't the starting goalie for Finland at the Four Nations, which you would have thought going into it last summer, he would have been the nailed-on first goalie for Finland. That was not how that really worked out for poor Saros. So I guess I'll start with Lucas, with you with this is, Gustav Nyquist to Minnesota, I think it's an interesting deal, but do you see any other Predators being on the move with how the things haven't gone the way Barry Trotz would have hoped for in Nashville?
Well, I definitely think that it's a possibility. And I think one of the big reasons for this Nyquist trade to begin with is the fact that, as you mentioned, so many people, including myself, thought that these guys were going to be Stanley Cup contenders. I mean, look at the names that they picked up in the offseason. It looked like this was going to be like an unbelievable team, like an unbelievable turnaround. And you look at where they are in the standings. Like, are we even looking at the same team that we thought we were looking at the start of the season? So when it comes to the Nyquist deal, they're trying to change things up a little bit. They know that clearly this is not working. And I don't think they're looking at trying to turn this season around. I think what they're trying to do is look ahead to next year now. I know they did that in the offseason for this year. It didn't work. But if you trade away some key pieces on this team, maybe some guys that haven't been there for very long, and try and get some more pieces that might be able to help you out in the long run, like maybe trade away Stammer. I'm not sure. Maybe trade away Marcia. So clearly, the guys that they've brought in haven't done what they've wanted them to do for the most part. So I think that if they find a way to trade one or two of these guys for maybe some younger pieces, or maybe some pieces that could definitely improve their team over the next year or two, I could see that happening. But at this point, I'm not too sure what Watts' plan is with that.
Well, JC, this could be rant territory. Maybe not as legendary as the Toronto Blue Jays one, JC. So I want to go to you last on this one, because I think we can have a lot of fun making fun of Barry Trotz and the gong show that's happened in Tennessee. But I'll now go to you, Mark McKelvey, because, again, you go through the names, and the two guys I didn't mention were guys that were already there, and Philip Forsberg, who's their leading point getter, and one of the best defensemen in hockey in Yossi, Roman Yossi. So it is kind of surprising that Nashville hasn't done at least better than they are now. Maybe not cup contenders, like as Lucas said, you kind of look at the guys on paper and go, man, this team looks really good. But like, I don't think anyone really expected them to be bad, straight out awful. I guess, Mark, kind of, do you see any other Predators being on the move before the deadline closes on Friday?
I think they'll do a little bit, but I don't think they can really change course just yet. I know that it was kind of threatened by Barry Trotz partway through the season, but you were putting your faith in a lot of early 30s guys, which I'm an early 30s guy, but I don't play in the NHL. And I imagine if I was in the NHL, I would be probably counting down my days. It's just becoming a younger league, and you're going after your Stamkos and your Marchessaults. And even, Philip Forsberg feels like he's been around forever. He's younger than those guys. So I think the one thing is, though, sometimes that veteran presence, they can dig deep and get it done. I just think this team got behind the eight ball so bad at the start of the year that I'd almost, and maybe it sounds crazy, but I'd almost want to run it back next year. I think you're looking at dealing away some of those depth guys more than anything. I mean, Luke Schen's going to fetch something. He gets dealt every year at the trade deadline, it feels, but a contender's going to add him as a number 6 defenseman. Michael McCarron is a bottom, I won't even say bottom 6. He's a bottom 3 forward, a fourth liner who can crash and bang and can fight. He's at the end of a contract, so maybe he goes somewhere. I just think, though, they got to keep that high-end talent, so to speak, try and run it back next season because you took a swing. It's been a miss, but I do have faith in winners. Guys aren't winners by mistake, and I think there's a lot of pride in that locker room.
I don't disagree with you, Mark, but I will say, as you mentioned, that a bunch of those guys, Ryan O'Reilly, Jonathan Marchessault, Steven Stamkos, 34, 35. So expecting them to kind of change all of what's happened this year, next year, I do think a bit of a leap, and I think that's kind of what you admitted at the beginning.
Well, I think
it's really hard to change that at that later stage of your career. But obviously, we've seen players do it. Joe Pavelski did it in Dallas. I think we've seen Logan Couture do that a time or two. So it's not impossible. Just I guess my only question to you, Mark, would be kind of I just don't really see how all of them do that. If one or two do it, sure.
But that's what I'm thinking. 1 or 2 potentially. Your Philip Forsberg, he's still got another gear. He leads the team in points. I think he's clear by, I looked the other day, he's clear by like 10 points. And then you never know who you could pluck this season in the offseason, or if you've got those prospects that are coming along. I think a Luke Evangelista has kind of been a bit of a disappointment this season, but everyone's been a disappointment. He's only 22. You're not going to give up on him. He's pretty highly touted. So I think there could be another step with this group. I also just think for Barry Trotz's sake, if you blow it up after 1 year, the faith in your management skills are completely out the window, right? I think he's earned it there because of his legendary status in Nashville. So maybe, just maybe, you try and just make some minor tweaks and hope these guys can pull you out of the fire next season.
What about you, JC? Any big moves going into Nashville? And again, I left you the room for if you want to kind of tear into Barry Trotz like I would if I was a panelist. Good, JC, you have the floor. Any trades made by Nashville?
I mean, my argument with Barry Trotz is the same with any coach that has ever coached with that fire of you're going to call out your players, you're going to be mean to them. Like, there's been so many over the history of the NHL, and their timelines are very short. It's 2 to 3 years, and then they eventually phase out. For Barry Trotz, in the position that he's in, it's. I mean, sometimes you're just in over your head, and sometimes you make the mistakes. And Spencer, you mentioned it. They went out and they acquired a lot of big names. They are big names on paper, but they're not necessarily guys that can gel and that can bring a team together. And unfortunately, what we've witnessed in Nashville this season is a failed experiment. They got a lot of high-end talent, but that high-end talent isn't doing the job. And now you're stuck with a lot of players that are going to be tough to move. I mean, when you look down the list, you've got some big contracts there. You've got some contracts that last anywhere from 1 to 3 seasons still after this year. You know, you might have an opportunity to move like a Luke Schenn, for example, because you get a veteran defenseman who's pretty good at what he does as a shutdown guy. There will be some teams right now that are looking for some depth defensemen that will probably look at that $2.75 million contract and go, yeah, okay. And then we get to keep him for an extra year. So it's not necessarily a rental situation. So he might be able to go. A guy like Ryan O'Reilly is going to be a little harder to move at $4.5 million with 2 years left on that. That's going to be tough for teams that right now are up against a salary cap. And, you know, I include the Leafs in that. I am sure they'd love to give him another go, but I just don't see them being able to afford him. Most of these teams that are playoff bound right now and are strong are going to be worried about cap issues. So you're going to be hard fought to move these guys, but the experiment hasn't worked. So really, you kind of are looking at a rebuild. And if you look at a rebuild, you're looking at, being near the bottom of the West for the next 5 years probably, which is terrible. But sometimes it's a necessary thing to happen. I don't know in a market like Nashville that's necessarily something that they can afford to do. I think they have to kind of stay competitive and kind of keep that building full on a nightly basis, on a game-by-game basis. So it won't be an easy deadline for the Predators. They've got some assets, there's no question about it, but whether they find the right fit, whether they're able to get the future back for them, there'll be dance partners out there. I know Winnipeg's going to be a big buyer, but who they can afford and who they're willing to take on, who fits the mold, there's not many days to figure that out.
Well, guys, before we hit the OHL and talk about the last 8 to 10 games of the OHL season with the Attack firmly in the Western playoff race for the 8th and 7th playoff spots, I want to give everybody about 1 minute to give me a sales pitch on one more player to be dealt. One big name. If that's Erik Karlsson, if that's Braden Shen with the St. Louis Blues, whoever, Sidney Crosby even with the Pittsburgh Penguins, I don't care who you pick. Just give me about a minute sales pitch on why you think that guy is going to be dealt. And even if you want to give me a destination, even better. I'm going to start with you, Mark McKelvey. Who is the one guy you look down the kind of big name, big fish list going into Friday and say, that guy's going to get dealt?
Well, I think every year at the trade deadline, there's always a mix of your wily veterans, and then there's some young players that could maybe slip through the cracks. A player that I would look at from the Buffalo Sabres is Dylan Cousins. The Sabres, I mean, let's be honest, it's just another disappointing season. It doesn't feel like anything's changing. And they have dealt away some incredible players over the years. We talked about Ryan O'Reilly. Sam Reinhart was there at one point, up and down the list. As soon as Jack Eichel leaves, he went to Vegas, but he goes and wins a cup. For me, Dylan Cousins has a lot of upside, a young player he's young, but he's already been in the league like 5 years now. I think he's only like 23 years old. So he's got that experience. He's been around the block. He's a proven 30-goal scorer. And I think if you're Buffalo, there seems to be a little bit of uneasiness there on his side, whether or not he's going to be staying long term. He's a big trade chip for them. I think a team would be, if they would give up quite a bit to get a Dylan Cousins, and I think he would complement a team not just this year but going forward. So he's a player I'd be after. Because after that, I don't know. I just see a lot of veterans, and I feel like they're one and the same. A lot of these guys, other than maybe a Scott Lawton. I don't want to steal someone else's pick, but I mean, I don't know if there's that huge impact guy necessarily.
What about you, Lucas? Any player you think is your sales pitch for to be dealt by Friday?
Well, one that I'm a little, half and half on is Sidney Crosby. Now, Crosby, he's 37 years old, and he's been a great player his entire career, and I mean he proved that again during the Four Nations face-off. He was amazing. Now, the reason why I think that he might go, and I know he's one of those guys along with Alex Ovechkin where you look at them and you go, these guys are going to be playing for one team their entire career, and you think that. Then some players they say, oh yeah, I want to play my entire career here. Then they end up somewhere else near the end of said career. And I wonder if Crosby would end up elsewhere. And the reason I say that is because being 37, you don't have a whole lot of years left in the league at this point, knowing with when people typically retire when it comes to the older ages in the NHL. And the Penguins are not having a very good year. They're nowhere near a wild card spot at the moment. They've got some work to do if they want to fight their way up there this year. But if he goes, I think if he goes, he's going somewhere where he has a potential to win another cup. He's already won a few of them. He doesn't necessarily need to win another one, but there's always that fight, that pressure to win and win and win. He wants to win another one. I think ideally for him, he wins another one in Pittsburgh, but just don't think it would happen. If he's going to win another one, he'd have to end up elsewhere.
I definitely don't see it happening in Pittsburgh. I agree with you there, Lucas. Hopefully he gets dealt just for the media storm that would happen, regardless of where he goes. And obviously we can talk about all the landing spots that would be in your mind fantasy wise. Like I know Leaf fans would love him to wear maple leaf, and I would make me want to vomit all over everything as a Bruins fan. So JC, who's your sales pitch for one guy you think will be dealt by Friday, or you hope will be dealt by Friday?
Well, a quick side note, if Pittsburgh's going to be dealing, I know there's been some rumors that Erik Karlsson might come back to Ottawa, which I would love to see him come back to Ottawa. He considers that home. His wife is from there. He raised quite a lot when he was in Ottawa, so him getting reunited with Daniel Alfredsson and coming back into the fold would be okay by me. But to kind of lead into our OHL talk, there's a lot of rumors going around that Colby Barlow might be dealt by the Winnipeg Jets right now. And if you're looking at Winnipeg, I mean, they're first overall in the NHL as we speak. They are going to hear the footsteps behind them from Dallas, from Vegas, who always does well, and any opportunity you have. I mean, Winnipeg's got a lot of great future coming up right now. Colby Barlow isn't the only guy that is a good piece of their future. So he might be a guy that's going to get them some pretty big chips, maybe even be able to retain some salary by another team, which Winnipeg right now, they're not doing the greatest when it comes to the financial department, so they wouldn't mind if they could get a 50% salary retention by acquiring someone. They do need a little bit of depth there. They could probably get a high draft pick as well, but I think, and I would not be surprised if Colby Barlow is one of those young guns that gets dealt at the deadline.
And it'd be interesting to see who Winnipeg would think is a good fit in that trade to get back. If that's a big fish like Ryan, like one of the Nashville guys, that's Brock Besser from Vancouver. With Vancouver's fire sale continuing after their disappointing season this year, it'd be really interesting to see what the valuation by other teams of Colby Barlow is after he kind of fell to Winnipeg in last year's draft. Now, guys, we will move to the OHL. I'll stick with you, JC, on this one. It's still basically a 4-horse race if you want to include Guelph in that. Maybe 3 horses if you want to exclude Guelph, between Owen Sound, Sault Ste. Marie, as well as Sarnia for the 7, 8, and 9 spots right now in the West. And we've kind of talked about it throughout the broadcast we've had the last couple of home games, in that the Attack have been playing really good hockey, especially at home, and that they are a team that we feel like could definitely make a push for those last 2 playoff spots. I guess on Sports Rap here, would you kind of agree with that assessment, JC, of where Owen Sound will finish as the season comes to a close with the last 10 to 8 games left?
Well, I mean, the kind of hockey they played down the stretch has been pretty good. It's not necessarily the best of those 4 teams, but it's pretty solid. And this team truly is a team. I mean, there's a lot of belief in that dressing room, and you really never know on a nightly basis who's going to step up and be the hero. Sometimes it's Max Blysha playing a forward shift. Like, it's been a very fun team to watch. That said, it's not going to be easy. It's going to start this weekend in Erie. And luckily in Erie, they're facing a team that they know pretty well from recent history. They took 3 out of 4 points against the Otters recently. They're going down to Erie, which is always a tough road trip. They'll have the Attack pack there to cheer them on, which will always help. Plus, Erie is just in complete disarray. And the incident with Peterborough this past weekend, where the coaches got into a fight between the benches, really shows you that things are not all that great in Erie. They've had a lot of stuff happen off the ice this year that I don't care who you are as a player, that affects you. That gets into your head, and you're always wondering. And I mean, right now it's a possibility that Flint is going to pass them, and they're going to fall even further in the standings. So it should be hopefully another 3 or 4 points, or 4 out of 4 points for the Attack this weekend. And then it doesn't really get easier after that. I mean, they do come back home. They've got 2 games next week. Flint's going to be here on Wednesday night next week. Kitchener's going to be here again next Saturday. That's a team they match up against well for top teams, is the Kitchener Rangers. But of those 8 remaining games, 5 are on the road. And your last game of the season is against Guelph, who's pretty much fallen, we'll say, out of the race at this point. I mean, they have an outside chance that they could still compete if everybody falters and they're able to pull ahead. But right now, the last game of the season remains just as critical at this point as it will on March 22nd, is that they're going to need those 2 points against Guelph, and then they won't even have their own history or their own future in their own hands, because the following day, Sarnia plays the Sioux. And that will be a tough one to watch on that Sunday, March 23rd, the final day of the OHL regular season. But as Greg Cowan said this week, and I think Mark McKelvey echoed it, how much would you love to see that 1-game playoff? That would be outstanding to have that extra game of the OHL season. And I think there's a strong possibility we might see that.
Well, and I will quickly explain that. We did talk about that on the Bear Tracker Weekly podcast, JC, about how if it's 8 and 9 are tied, they play a 69th game to see who gets the 8th seed. The 7th seed will just be by the normal tiebreakers row and then so on and so forth. But if 8 and 9 are tied, they will play an extra game to see who gets the 8th spot to then play London Knights at this point. So I'm not sure that's exactly, you get to win to play the best team in maybe the CHL, but definitely the OHL. So I'll go now to you, Mark. Kind of, how do you look at the last 8 to 10 games for the Owen Sound attack as the playoffs loom in Owen Sound, as much as we'd love to do some more home games?
Well, they're 5-5 in their last 10. I think they're going to be 500 down the stretch. They've got some tough matchups. You got Kitchener a couple more times. You just beat them the other night. You don't think that left a sour taste in Kitchener's mouth? I know they don't have much to play for in terms of positioning, but it's tough games, and you got to win the ones you're supposed to win. If they can sweep that against Guelph, that'd be huge. It won't be easy, though. Those teams know each other well, and I find it's always a chess match. But I think it's realistic to think this team goes 4-4. And then you look at the remaining schedule for Sarnia and Sioux. Those teams play each other a couple of times. As JC mentioned, they play on the last day of the year. And I count who they're facing, and I only really see 4 wins for both of those teams. So I think the way it's set up right now might just be the way it's going to end, and we could be destined for that tiebreaker game. I don't think a whole lot's going to swing. We know what these teams are. I don't think any of the 3 teams all of a sudden is going to catch fire and go 6-2 or 7-1 down the stretch. I think 500 is believable for all 3 teams, but I think for this attack group, that belief is there. But as we saw on Friday night against the London Knights, sometimes you just get run over by a better team. So hopefully, maybe from an attack standpoint, your Kitchener's take a night off, or some of those tough games, those teams aren't as locked in the way you are, not having as much to play for. But I think we got to be realistic here. I think it's going to come right down to the final weekend.
Well, Lucas, as we kind of go into the last couple minutes here of the show, I do want to kind of skip to the Eastern Conference. The 4 teams are within 3 points of first place, including the team who's at top right now with 81 points, 2, 3, and 4, all at 78. Who do you think comes out with the East right now as Brantford does lead it currently?
Well, I mean, it's a very tight race. And I think last year we had a very similar situation where the race for like the final, playoff spots, or just playoff spots in general in the East, it was so unbelievably close. Now, part of me wants to say that the Bulldogs will remain where they are at the top. They're 3 points ahead of the Colts with 1 game in hand. I really like the way that they've looked this season. I think that they have a very, very solid chance of just remaining in that number 1 spot. However, you can't count the Colts and the Generals out. They've had great seasons too. 37-18 for the Colts, 36-18 for the Generals. But that's obviously without the overtime losses and all that. That's just wins and losses. Those are some good numbers. Of course, the Bulldogs 38-17. The Frontenac's are there as well. It's a 3-way tie for 78 points from second, third, and fourth. 78 points. Frontenac's 35 wins and 16 losses over a 59-game stretch. So they have a game in hand, and the Colts have a game in hand on the Generals and the Bulldogs. So I think, just like what Mark said with the other topic, this will come down to the either last 2 games or last game of the season.
Well, JC, we have about 45 seconds left, so I'll split this between you and Mark. Who do you think wins the Eastern Conference between those 4 teams? Colts, Brantford, Kingston with Guédon, Oshawa.
Boy, that's just a murderer's roll of teams, and you can really flip a coin in the air. But based on the way Brantford has been consistently playing this season, I think it's probably going to be the Bulldogs that hold on and win the conference.
And they've been great down the stretch. Ryerson Leenders was the goalie of the month last month for a reason. He's been spectacular. Nick Lardis was the player of the year with all his goals, 65 and counting. Mark McKelvey, who do you think wins the East?
I'm going with Brantford. That 3-point lead coming into the final few weeks is probably going to be enough, because I just don't think any of those teams can all of a sudden just run the table. They've also got games left against North Bay and Ottawa, so a few slam dunks there, and everyone's peaking at the right time if you're a Brantford Bulldogs fan.
All right.
Connect with us by visiting our website or email us at comments@rogerstv.com.
RTV Sports Rap every Wednesday as myself, Spencer Byers, and our esteemed channel talk about everything you need to know going on in football, basketball, baseball, hockey, and soccer as we joust about what's going on in sports, keeping you up to date on Rogers TV.
Looking for your favorite home renovation shows?
They know what they want. They don't know where to find it.
We do.
Look right here. Only HGTV has all new seasons of Celebrity IOU. The Flipping on Mooses.
Blowing away the competition.
Hometown.
Yeah, baby!